The candles in the ballroom of Ashford Hall had barely been lit when the whispers began. 100 women had already tried, and failed, to win the attention of the Duke of Ashford, and tonight, it seemed, 101 would try again. Edmund Ashford stood near the tall windows with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, already counting the minutes until he could leave his own party. He had learned to recognize the signs from across a room, the practiced laugh that came a half-second too late, the way a woman's eyes would drift toward him and then quickly away, as if she had not been staring at all, the mothers positioned like generals at the edges of the dance floor, watching every movement he made, as though his steps might reveal the secrets of his fortune. Edmund was tired of being studied like a ledger. Every woman who approached him carried the same hunger behind her smile, and every conversation felt like a performance he had rehearsed 100 times before. He answered questions about his estate, his horses, his plans for the season, and none of it meant anything, because none of it was really about him. He had not always been this way. There had been a time, years ago, when he believed a woman might want him, and not his title. That belief had cost him something he still did not like to think about, and in its place, he had built a wall so high that even his own family had stopped trying to climb it. His aunt, Lady Beatrice, found him by the window, her fan snapping open with the sharp sound of someone who had already decided how the evening would end. "You cannot hide here all night," she said. "There are at least a dozen young ladies who have crossed the room twice already, hoping you would notice them." "I noticed," Edmund said. "That is precisely the problem." Lady Beatrice sighed, the sound of a woman who had spent years managing a man who refused to be managed. "You are 37, Edmund. The family needs an heir. The estate needs a mistress. And you need, whether you admit it or not, someone in your life besides your ledgers and your horses." "I have never needed anyone," he said, and he meant it, though something in his chest tightened as he said it, as if the words did not sit as comfortably as they once had. He excused himself before she could answer, and moved along the edge of the room, nodding politely to guests who tried to catch his eye, offering the smallest, most economical smiles he could manage. It was a skill he had perfected. Enough warmth to avoid offense, not enough to invite conversation. It was near the far end of the room, close to where the musicians were tuning their instruments for the next set, that he first saw her. She was not dancing. She was not watching him. She was not doing any of the things the other women in the room seemed determined to do. She stood near a table of refreshments, a glass of lemonade in her hand, watching the dancers with an expression of quiet amusement, as though she found the entire spectacle mildly entertaining and nothing more. She wore a gown of pale green, simpler than most in the room, without the elaborate trimmings the other women favored. Her dark hair was pinned back plainly, a few strands escaping near her temple. She looked, Edmund thought, like someone who had wandered into the wrong party and did not particularly mind. He watched her for a long moment, waiting for her to notice him the way everyone else did. She did not. Her attention stayed on the dance floor, on a young couple who kept missing their steps, and when they finally collided into another pair, she pressed her lips together to hide a laugh. Edmund felt something shift inside him, small and strange, like a door opening in a room he had thought was sealed shut. He asked a passing footman who she was. "That is Miss Eleanor Hartley, Your Grace," the footman said. "She is companion to Lady Vane. She is not on the guest list for courting, if that is what you mean." Edmund did not answer. He was still watching her, and she still had not looked at him once. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself wanting to cross a room. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. A man notices when something breaks a pattern he has grown used to, and Eleanor Hartley, breaking the pattern of female attention in his ballroom, was simply an anomaly worth investigating. That was the story he told himself, as he made his way toward her, weaving between clusters of guests who turned to watch him pass, their conversations dying mid-sentence. She did not turn when he stopped beside her. She continued watching the dancers, sipping her lemonade, as if a duke standing 3 feet away was not worth the effort of acknowledgement. "Miss Hartley," he said. She turned then, and he saw her eyes were a clear, steady gray, unbothered by the fact that she was speaking to the most sought-after man in the room. "Your Grace," she said, with a small, polite nod, and then, to his surprise, she turned her attention back to the dance floor. He had expected many reactions, flattery, nervousness. Even feigned indifference, which he had encountered before and could spot within seconds. This was different. This was genuine disinterest, and it left him oddly unsteady on his feet. "You do not dance," he said, because it was the only thing he could think to say. "I dance poorly," she said. "I prefer to watch those who do it well, and laugh quietly at those who do not." He found himself almost smiling. "That is not very charitable of you." "Charity was never my strongest virtue," she said. "Patience, perhaps. Honesty, certainly. Charity, I am afraid, comes and goes depending on how many times a man steps on his partner's slippers." He laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch the attention of several nearby guests, who turned to stare in open astonishment. Edmund Ashford did not laugh at balls. He barely spoke at balls. Eleanor glanced at him then, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face, quickly suppressed. "You are not what I expected," she said. "And what did you expect?" he asked. "Someone far less amused by his own party," she said. And there was no flattery in it, only observation, the kind a woman makes when she is genuinely trying to understand a person, rather than trying to win him. Before he could answer, Lady Vane appeared at Eleanor's side, her expression tight with the particular anxiety of a woman who has just watched her companion speak to a duke without permission. "Eleanor, dear, we should return to our seats," Lady Vane said, her eyes darting nervously toward Edmund. "Forgive her, your grace. She does not always remember her place." "I was not aware she had forgotten it," Edmund said, and something in his tone made both women look at him in surprise. Eleanor offered a small, unreadable smile, before allowing herself to be led away, and Edmund stood alone by the refreshment table, watching her go, feeling the strange and unfamiliar pull of wanting to follow. He did not follow, not yet. He simply watched her disappear into the crowd, and for the rest of the evening, though a dozen more women approached him with practiced smiles and rehearsed questions, he found he could not stop thinking about the one who had not. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Edmund sat alone in his study, with a glass of brandy he did not drink. His father's portrait hung above the fireplace, stern and unmoving, a reminder of duty and legacy, and all the things Edmund was supposed to want. He thought of the 100 women who had smiled at him over the years, each one wanting something he could give, but none of them wanting him. He thought of the one woman who had wanted nothing at all, who had looked at him the way she might look at any other guest, and who had made him laugh in a ballroom for the first time in years. He told himself it meant nothing, a passing curiosity, easily forgotten by morning. But when morning came, he found himself asking his aunt, with careful casualness, whether Lady Vane and her companion would be attending the garden party at the end of the week. Lady Beatrice looked at him for a long moment, something sharp and knowing in her eyes. "Why do you ask?" she said. "No reason," Edmund said, and even he did not believe himself. Outside, the sun was rising over Ashford Hall, and for the first time in years, Edmund found himself looking forward to a party he had not wanted to attend. He spent the rest of that morning pretending to review correspondence from his steward, though his eyes kept drifting to the window, to the long gravel drive where carriages had rolled away the night before. He told himself he was thinking about the harvest reports, about the repairs needed on the eastern fences, about anything except a woman in a pale green gown who had laughed at his own ballroom without once trying to please him. It did not work. By midday, he had read the same paragraph of a tenant's letter 3 times without understanding a word of it, and he finally set the papers aside with a frustration that surprised him. He was a man known for his discipline. Since he was a young man, he had trained himself to want only what was useful, to feel only what was necessary, and to keep the rest locked away where it could not interfere with the running of an estate that depended on his steady hand. It was a discipline that had served him well through years of fortune hunters and calculating mothers, through seasons of balls where every woman in the room seemed to know the exact value of his title, down to the last acre. Eleanor Hartley had looked at him and seen none of it. She had seen a man standing awkwardly near a refreshment table, amused by her own commentary on clumsy dancers, and she had spoken to him as though he were simply a person, rather than a prize to be won. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. That afternoon, his cousin Gerald arrived unannounced, as he often did when he needed money or gossip, sometimes both at once. Gerald settled into the chair across from Edmund's desk, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once worried about his place in the world, though in truth his fortunes depended entirely on Edmund's goodwill. "They say you laughed last night," Gerald said, before Edmund had even offered him a drink. An actual laugh. Lady Winslow nearly fainted from the shock of it. Edmund did not look up from his papers. "People exaggerate." "Do they?" Gerald said, leaning forward with obvious interest. "Because I heard it was over a companion. Not one of the eligible ladies your aunt paraded past you all evening, but Lady Vane's companion. A Miss Hartley, I believe." "You heard correctly," Edmund said, offering nothing further, though he felt the weight of his cousin's attention settle on him like a hand on his shoulder. Gerald's expression shifted, something calculating passing behind his easy smile, before it vanished again. "How curious," he said lightly. A duke laughing at his own party, and not for any of the reasons his family might have hoped. Edmund set down his pen. "Was there something you needed, Gerald, or did you simply come to discuss my manners?" Gerald laughed and waved a hand, the moment of calculation folding itself back beneath his usual charm. "Only to see how you fared after last night's ordeal, and to remind you that the garden party at Lady Winslow's estate is Friday next. I trust you will attend." "I had not decided," Edmund said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew it was not entirely true. He had already asked his aunt whether Lady Vane would be there. He had already, without quite admitting it to himself, begun to hope. After Gerald left, Edmund stood at the window of his study for a long while, watching the light change over the grounds of Ashford Hall, thinking of a woman who had not wanted anything from him at all, and wondering, with a mixture of curiosity and something close to unease, what it might mean to cross a room toward someone who did not expect him to. Lady Winslow's garden party began beneath a sky so clear it seemed almost unfair, as though the weather itself had conspired to make the afternoon pleasant for everyone except Eleanor Hartley, who would have preferred to be almost anywhere else. She stood near a hedge of white roses, holding a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking, watching Lady Vane move through the crowd of guests with the particular energy of a woman determined to secure a good match for herself, though she had already been married twice and buried both husbands with remarkable composure. Eleanor's role, as always, was to remain close, to fetch what was needed, and to say as little as possible unless directly addressed. It was a role she had grown used to over the past 2 years, since her father's business had failed and left her with very little beyond her education and her pride. She did not resent the work, exactly. Lady Vane was not unkind, only self-absorbed in the way of women who had never needed to consider anyone else's feelings for very long. But there were moments, standing at the edge of gatherings like this one, watching young women her own age laugh and dance and dream of futures that did not depend on someone else's goodwill, when Eleanor felt the particular ache of being present without truly belonging. She had not expected to think about the Duke of Ashford again after the ball. She had certainly not expected to think about him as often as she had, in the quiet hours before sleep, remembering the surprised sound of his laugh, so unlike the careful, guarded expression he wore for the rest of the world. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not fall into conversation with companions and then think of them again. It had been a passing moment, forgotten by him within the hour, and she would do well to forget it just as quickly. And yet, when a ripple of attention moved through the garden, when heads turned and voices dropped and Lady Vane straightened her posture with sudden and obvious excitement, Eleanor felt her own heart give an unwelcome little jump before she had even turned to look. The Duke of Ashford had arrived, and unlike every other gathering Eleanor had witnessed him attend, he was not standing at the edge of the crowd with his usual guarded distance. He was moving through the garden with something almost like purpose, exchanging brief pleasantries with the guests who approached him, his eyes moving over the crowd as though searching for something. She told herself it was not her he was searching for. She busied herself with rearranging the teacups on the nearby table, focusing entirely on the task, refusing to look up even as she felt his approach, the way one feels a change in weather before the first drop of rain. "Miss Hartley," he said. She looked up, arranging her expression into polite neutrality. "Your Grace, I did not expect to see you take such an interest in garden parties." "I do not, ordinarily," he admitted, and there was something disarming in his honesty, something that made it harder for her to maintain the careful distance she had promised herself she would keep. "But I found myself curious whether the lemonade here was any better than at my own ball." "And is it?" she asked, allowing herself the smallest smile. Regrettably, no, he said. Lady Winslow's kitchen is entirely too fond of sugar. Eleanor laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, quickly muffled behind her hand, and she saw something shift in his expression, a warmth that had not been there in his earlier, more careful smiles. Lady Vane appeared at her side almost instantly, drawn by the sound of the Duke's voice, the way a hawk is drawn to movement in tall grass. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy so deep it seemed designed to make a point. "What an unexpected pleasure. I do hope my companion has not been troubling you with her opinions. She has a great many of them, and very little sense of when to keep them to herself." "I find her opinions quite refreshing," Edmund said, his tone even, though Eleanor noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the barest hint of displeasure at Lady Vane's dismissive tone. "Perhaps you might allow Miss Hartley to walk with me through the garden. I understand there is a rather notable collection of orange trees near the far wall." Lady Vane's eyes widened with poorly concealed delight, already calculating the social advantage of having her companion singled out by a duke, even if the honor was misplaced. "Eleanor, do go on. Mind your manners." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm with an embarrassment she could not entirely name, as Edmund offered his arm and led her away from the tea table, away from Lady Vane's watchful eyes, toward the quieter paths at the edge of the garden. "You did not need to do that," she said, once they were far enough from the crowd that she felt she could speak freely. "Do what?" he asked. "Rescue me from my own employer," Eleanor said. "I am quite capable of enduring her comments without assistance." "I do not doubt it," Edmund said. "But I find I would rather speak with you without an audience determining the value of every word we exchange." Eleanor glanced at him sideways, studying his profile, the firm line of his jaw, the way his careful, guarded expression seemed to soften slightly when he was not aware of being watched by the wider world. "Why," she asked, "does a duke who could have any woman in England care to speak with a companion who has nothing to offer him?" Edmund was quiet for a moment, his steps slowing as they reached the edge of the orange trees, the scent of blossoms heavy in the warm afternoon air. "Because every woman who has ever spoken to me wanted something," he said finally. "My title, my fortune, the security of my name. And you, Miss Hartley, looked at me across a ballroom, as though I were nothing more than mildly interesting furniture." Eleanor could not help but laugh again, though this time there was something gentler in it, something closer to understanding. "I did not mean to insult you." "You did not," he said. "You have no idea how strange it is, to be looked at and not measured. I find I would like to understand it better." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, the noise of the party fading behind them, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds settling into the trees for the evening. "May I ask you something?" Eleanor said finally. "Anything," he said. "Why have you rejected every woman who has approached you these past years?" she asked. "The whole of society speaks of it, as though it were some great mystery, but I imagine the answer is simpler than they think." Edmund's expression shifted, something guarded passing behind his eyes before he answered. "When I was younger, there was a woman I believed cared for me," he said slowly, as though the words cost him something to speak aloud. "I later learned she cared a great deal for my title, and very little for the man beneath it. It was not a gentle lesson, and I have spent the years since making certain I would not learn it twice." Eleanor's expression softened with something that was not quite pity, something closer to recognition. "That is a lonely way to live," she said quietly. "It is," he admitted, "though I had not thought of it as lonely until recently." She did not ask what had changed. She thought, perhaps, she already knew, and the knowledge sat uneasily in her chest, equal parts flattering and frightening. They returned to the party as the afternoon began to fade toward evening, and Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes following them as they emerged from the orange trees together. Whispers followed in their wake, quiet and speculative, and she saw Lady Vane's expression shift from delight to something more calculating, as though reconsidering the value of her companion now that a duke had shown such open interest. That evening, in the small room she occupied in Lady Vane's townhouse, Eleanor sat by the window long after the household had gone quiet, thinking of orange blossoms and honest confessions, of a man who had spent years building walls that seemed, however slowly, to be coming down in her presence. She told herself, as she had told herself before, that it meant nothing lasting. A duke did not marry a companion. Society would never allow it, and even if it would, She was not certain she wanted the complications that came with a man of his position, the scrutiny, the gossip, the families who would never accept her as anything more than a passing curiosity. And yet, when she closed her eyes that night, it was not the safety of her careful reasoning she carried into sleep, but the memory of his voice, low and honest among the orange trees, admitting to a loneliness he had not known he carried, until she had somehow, without meaning to, begun to ease it. Across the city, in his own quiet study, Edmund sat with a letter from his aunt unopened on the desk before him, his mind entirely occupied with gray eyes and an honest laugh, and the growing, undeniable certainty that he wanted to see Eleanor Hartley again, whatever the cost of wanting her might prove to be. News of the garden party walk traveled faster than either of them could have predicted. By the following morning, it had reached every drawing room in the city, passed from maid to mistress and mistress to friend, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until the simple fact of a duke walking a companion past a row of orange trees had transformed, in the mouths of the gossips, into something far more scandalous than it had actually been. Lady Beatrice arrived at Ashford Hall before Edmund had even finished his morning coffee, her expression a careful mixture of concern and calculation that he had come to recognize over the years as the look she wore when she believed something needed to be managed. "You cannot be serious," she said, without any greeting at all, settling into the chair across from him, with the air of a woman prepared to argue for as long as necessary. Walking Lady Vane's companion through a private garden, in full view of half the ton. "Do you have any notion of what is being said this morning?" "I imagine a great many things," Edmund said, unbothered, sipping his coffee with a calm that only seemed to frustrate his aunt further. "Edmund," she said, her voice softening into something closer to genuine worry, "I understand that the girl amused you. I understand that you are tired of being chased by women who care nothing for you. But a companion, Edmund, a woman with no fortune, no connections, no family name worth mentioning. The family cannot accept such a match, and society will devour her reputation before it ever devours yours." "I have not proposed marriage, Aunt," he said, though even as he spoke the words, something in his chest resisted them, as though the idea, once given voice, refused to be dismissed as easily as he wanted it to be. "Not yet," Lady Beatrice said pointedly, "but I have known you your whole life, and I have never once seen you seek out a woman's company the way you sought hers yesterday. I am asking you, as someone who loves you, to consider what you are risking, not only for yourself, but for her. Society is not kind to women who rise above their station, whether or not they ask to be raised." Edmund said nothing for a long moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands, thinking of Eleanor's honest laugh among the orange blossoms, of the quiet ache in her voice when she had called his years of guarded loneliness exactly what it was. "I hear you," he said finally, "but I find I am tired of living a life shaped entirely around what other people believe I should want." Lady Beatrice studied him for a long moment, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to soften her further protests into a resigned, worried silence. "Just be careful," she said quietly, rising to leave, "for both your sakes." Across the city, in a rather less elegant townhouse, Gerald Ashford received the same morning's gossip with an entirely different reaction. He listened to his valet's account of the garden party with growing interest, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face as the details settled into place. Gerald had never particularly liked his cousin, though he had always been careful to hide his resentment behind easy charm and convenient visits. It was a simple, familiar bitterness, born from years of watching Edmund inherit everything of consequence, while Gerald was left with a modest allowance and the constant, humiliating necessity of asking for more. If Edmund remained unmarried and without an heir, Gerald's own position in the family's eventual inheritance grew stronger with every year that passed. A duke, besotted with an unsuitable companion, was, to Gerald's calculating mind, either a disaster to be prevented or an opportunity to be carefully shaped, depending on how the matter was handled. He dressed carefully that morning and made his way to the home of Lord Callum Whitmore, a man of considerable standing who had, for the better part of 2 seasons, harbored his own ambitions toward securing a connection to the Ashford family, though his interest had always been aimed at Edmund's younger sister rather than Edmund himself. Whitmore received him in his study, listening with growing displeasure, as Gerald described the scene in Lady Winslow's garden, the Duke's obvious attention, the companion's unexpected rise in social interest. "This complicates matters considerably," Whitmore said, once Gerald had finished. "If the Duke's attention wanders towards some penniless companion, it will hardly help my own standing with the family, nor will it help yours, if I understand your situation correctly." "I merely thought you would want to know," Gerald said, with the particular innocence of a man who had come with every intention of stirring exactly this reaction. "It seems a shame, does it not, that such an unsuitable connection might be allowed to flourish unchecked?" Whitmore's eyes narrowed with quiet calculation. "It does seem a shame," he agreed slowly. "Perhaps something ought to be done to remind the lady of her proper place, before matters progress any further than they already have." Gerald smiled and said nothing further, content to let the seed he had planted take root on its own, already imagining the satisfaction of watching his cousin's brief happiness unravel, one carefully placed rumor at a time. A week after the garden party, a note arrived at Lady Vane's townhouse, addressed not to Lady Vane herself, but to Eleanor directly, sealed with the unmistakable crest of the Ashford family. Eleanor stared at it for a long moment, before opening it, her hands unsteady in a way that annoyed her more than she wanted to admit. The note was brief. Edmund requested the pleasure of her company for a walk in the public gardens the following afternoon, properly chaperoned, of course, and signed simply with his name, no title attached, as though he wanted her to know the invitation came from the man rather than the Duke. Lady Vane, upon learning of the note, could hardly contain her excitement, already imagining the social advantages that might come from having secured, however indirectly, the attention of the most eligible man in the city. "You must go," she said, practically pushing Eleanor toward her small collection of gowns. "Wear the blue. It suits your coloring far better than that tired green you insist on favoring." Eleanor allowed herself to be dressed and fussed over, though her mind remained elsewhere, turning over the risks of what she was about to do. She was under no illusions about her position. A Duke's attention, however genuine it seemed, could not change the fundamental facts of her circumstances. She had no fortune, no family name of consequence, nothing to offer a man of Edmund's standing beyond her company, and companionship alone had never been enough to overcome the walls society built between people of different stations. And yet, when she arrived at the gardens the following afternoon and saw him waiting near the entrance, dressed simply, without the elaborate trappings of his rank, something in her chest loosened, despite every careful warning she had given herself. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice, some quiet relief, that told her he had genuinely doubted she would. "I nearly did not," she admitted, as they began walking along the gravel path, Lady Vane trailing at a discreet but watchful distance behind them. "I have been trying to convince myself that continuing to see you would be a mistake." "And has it worked?" he asked, glancing at her sideways with the barest hint of a smile. "Clearly not," she said, and he laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way that still surprised her every time she heard it. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, past beds of late summer flowers, past couples strolling arm in arm, past children chasing each other along the paths under the watchful eyes of their nurses. Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of the curious glances directed their way, the whispers that followed them at a discreet distance, and she felt the familiar tightness of anxiety building in her chest. "Edmund," she said finally, using his name without his title for the first time, testing the weight of it. "People are staring." "People always stare at me," he said. "It is one of the burdens of the title. I have simply grown accustomed to it." "I have not," she said, "and I worry what it means for you to be seen with me so often. Your family will not approve, society will not approve. I do not wish to become a scandal that follows you for the rest of your life." Edmund stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression more serious than she had yet seen it. "Eleanor," he said, and something in the way he said her name, without title or formality, made her breath catch slightly. "I have spent 7 years allowing other people's expectations to dictate every choice I made. I chose solitude because it was safer than risking what I had already lost once. But I find that solitude has begun to feel less like safety and more like a slow sort of suffocation. And I am no longer certain I wish to continue living that way simply because it is easier for everyone else." Eleanor searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity, any hint of the calculated performance she had grown so wary of in men of his standing, and found none. That is a great deal to admit to a companion you have known only a few weeks, she said quietly. Perhaps, he said, but I find that with you, I do not feel the need to measure my words as carefully as I do with everyone else. It is, I confess, rather freeing. They resumed walking, and Eleanor found herself, despite every careful warning she had given herself, allowing the conversation to deepen, sharing small pieces of her own history in return, the failure of her father's business, the sudden loss of the comfortable life she had once known, the particular loneliness of being present at every gathering and belonging to none of them. It was near the end of their walk, as they approached the gates where Lady Vane's carriage waited, that they encountered Lord Callum Whitmore, who seemed to have arranged his presence in the gardens with rather too much precision to be accidental. "Your Grace," Whitmore said, offering a shallow bow before his eyes moved deliberately to Eleanor, assessing her with an expression that made her skin prickle with discomfort. "And Miss Hartley, is it? I understand you have become quite the topic of conversation this season." "I was not aware conversation about me held any particular interest for you, Lord Whitmore," Eleanor said, keeping her tone even, despite the unease settling in her stomach. "Oh, it holds a great deal of interest," Whitmore said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "It is not every day one sees a duke so thoroughly captivated by a woman with so little to recommend her beyond, I suppose, a certain novelty. I do wonder how long such novelty tends to last." Edmund's expression hardened, a coldness entering his voice that Eleanor had not heard from him before. "Whitmore," he said, "I would suggest you choose your words more carefully when speaking to Miss Hartley in my presence." Whitmore raised his hands in mock surrender, though the calculating gleam in his eyes never wavered. "Merely an observation, Your Grace, no offense intended. I only hope, for both your sakes, that Miss Hartley understands precisely what she is stepping into. Society has a long memory for women who reach beyond their station, whatever affection a duke might feel in the moment." He offered another shallow bow and departed, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Eleanor felt her earlier ease evaporate entirely, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. "He is not entirely wrong," she said quietly, once Whitmore was out of earshot. "I have no protection against what people like him might say about me. You have your title to shield you from the worst of society's judgment. I have nothing at all." "You have me," Edmund said, and though his voice was firm, Eleanor found she could not quite let herself believe it. Not yet. Not when the cost of believing it wrongly would fall entirely upon her own shoulders. That evening, back in the small room she occupied at Lady Vane's townhouse, Eleanor sat with her sister's most recent letter unopened on her lap, thinking of Whitmore's cold smile and Edmund's quiet certainty, and wondering which of the two men understood her true situation more clearly. Her sister, Charlotte, depended on the modest wages Eleanor sent home each month to help support their widowed mother, and Eleanor could not afford to risk that support on the uncertain promise of a duke's affection, however genuine it seemed in the quiet moments between them. If society turned against her, if Lady Vane dismissed her from service over the scandal, there would be no one left to help her family, and no title grand enough to undo that particular kind of damage. She resolved, sitting alone in the candlelight, that she would see Edmund one more time, to explain, gently but firmly, that whatever had begun to grow between them could not be allowed to continue, not when the risks fell so entirely upon her and so lightly upon him. But resolutions made alone in quiet rooms had a way of weakening in the presence of the person they concerned, and when Edmund arrived at Lady Vane's townhouse 3 days later, having secured an invitation to a small evening gathering, specifically because he knew Eleanor would be present, Eleanor found her careful speech dissolving the moment he crossed the room toward her, ignoring every other guest present, his attention fixed entirely on her, the way it had been from the very first night at his own ball. "I had intended to tell you something important," she admitted, once they had found a quiet corner away from the other guests. "And what was that?" he asked. "That we should not continue this," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt their weakness, the way they crumbled slightly under the steady warmth of his gaze. "And have you changed your mind?" he asked, something gentle and knowing in his voice. "I am trying very hard not to," she admitted, and he smiled, the kind of smile that made it entirely impossible for her to remember why caution had ever seemed like the wiser choice. The following days brought a rhythm neither of them had expected. Edmund began finding reasons to attend every gathering where Eleanor might be present, and though he told himself each time that his interest was simply curiosity, simply the pleasure of good conversation, the household staff at Ashford Hall had already begun to notice the change in him. His valet remarked, quietly and only to the housekeeper, that his Grace had taken to humming while dressing in the mornings, a habit no one could recall him possessing before. The housekeeper, in turn, noted that fresh flowers had begun appearing in the smaller receiving room, though no one could quite explain why, since his Grace rarely used that room for anything at all. Lady Beatrice noticed too, and though her worry had not entirely faded, she found herself softening toward the situation in ways she had not expected. She began, cautiously, to make small inquiries about Eleanor's character among her own circle of acquaintances, and what she learned surprised her. Eleanor Hartley was, by every account, intelligent, well-read, unfailingly kind to servants and social equals alike, and entirely without the grasping ambition Lady Beatrice had feared might lie beneath her modest circumstances. It did not erase the practical obstacles standing between Eleanor and any future with Edmund, but it did begin to soften Lady Beatrice's resistance into something closer to cautious hope. Eleanor, for her part, found herself caught between the growing warmth of Edmund's attention and the persistent, gnawing worry of what it might cost her if the arrangement collapsed. She wrote to her sister Charlotte, choosing her words carefully, describing the Duke's kindness without revealing the full depth of what had begun to grow between them, uncertain how to explain something she barely understood herself. Charlotte's reply arrived within the week, full of warmth and gentle teasing, along with a note of caution that echoed Eleanor's own private fears. "You have always been sensible," Charlotte wrote, "and I trust you to guard your heart carefully. But do remember, dear sister, that men of his position have broken the hearts of far more experienced women than you, not always through cruelty, but simply through the weight of circumstances beyond their control. Guard yourself, but do not close yourself off entirely from happiness, should it prove genuine." Eleanor read the letter twice, folding it carefully into the small box where she kept her few treasured possessions, and resolved to proceed with caution, though caution, she was quickly learning, grew more difficult to maintain with every conversation she shared with Edmund. Meanwhile, Whitmore's cold warning in the gardens had not been an idle threat. In the weeks that followed, he began, carefully and deliberately, to plant seeds of doubt among his own circle of acquaintances, suggesting in quiet, seemingly innocent conversations that Eleanor Hartley's sudden rise in social attention seemed remarkably convenient, that a woman in her circumstances might have far more reason than most to seek out a wealthy protector, whatever her outward manner might suggest. Gerald, delighted by the effectiveness of his earlier suggestion, began contributing his own quiet observations to the growing rumor, careful never to be seen as the source, always framing his comments as concern for his cousin's welfare, rather than deliberate sabotage. "It is only that I worry for Edmund," he would say, with practiced sincerity, to anyone who would listen. "He has always been rather trusting when it comes to matters of the heart, and I would hate to see him taken advantage of by someone clever enough to recognize a lonely man when she saw one." The rumors spread slowly at first, the way poison spreads through water, undetectable, until its effects became impossible to ignore. By the time a full month had passed since the garden party, whispers had begun to follow Eleanor through every gathering she attended, quiet comments about calculating companions and ambitious young women who knew precisely how to exploit a duke's loneliness for their own advancement. Eleanor noticed the shift before Edmund did, the way conversations would pause slightly when she entered a room, the way certain women who had once been merely indifferent to her now regarded her with open suspicion. She said nothing of it to Edmund at first, unwilling to burden him with worries she was not yet certain were serious, hoping the whispers would fade as quickly as they had begun. They did not fade. If anything, they grew louder, fed carefully and deliberately, by two men with very different reasons for wanting to see Eleanor removed from Edmund's life, though only one of them, Gerald, understood the full extent of what damage such rumors might ultimately cause. It was at a musical evening hosted by Lady Winslow, nearly 6 weeks after the ball where it had all begun, that Eleanor first heard the whispers spoken clearly enough to leave no doubt about their meaning. She had stepped away from the main gathering to find a quiet moment alone, and had paused near an open doorway when she heard two women speaking in low, unguarded voices on the other side. One does wonder how a companion with no fortune manages to secure quite so much of the Duke's attention, one voice said. It seems almost too convenient, does it not, that a woman in her position should find herself so suddenly and thoroughly pursued. I have heard she was quite deliberate about it from the very first night, the other voice replied, positioning herself where he could not help but notice her, feigning disinterest to draw him in. It is a clever strategy, I will admit, though a rather calculated one, for a woman who claims to want nothing from him. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her chest tight with a mixture of anger and humiliation, the easy warmth of the evening curdling into something far colder. She retreated quietly, before either woman noticed her presence, finding a quiet corner of the garden where she could breathe without the weight of 100 curious, judging eyes upon her. It was there that Edmund found her some time later, his expression immediately shifting to concern at the sight of her pale face and tightly clasped hands. "What happened?" he asked, settling beside her without hesitation. Eleanor hesitated before answering, unwilling at first to voice the ugliness she had overheard, but Edmund's steady presence beside her eventually loosened the words from where she had been holding them. "They believe I planned this," she said quietly, "that I positioned myself deliberately at your ball, feigned indifference to draw your attention, calculated every moment since to secure your affection for my own advancement. They believe I am nothing more than a clever fortune hunter, wearing the disguise of disinterest." Edmund's jaw tightened with quiet anger, though his voice remained gentle when he spoke. "That is not true, and anyone who has spent even a moment in your company would know it is not true." "It does not matter whether it is true," Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "It only matters what people choose to believe, and once such a story takes hold, there is very little that can be done to undo it. I have seen it happen to other women, Edmund. Reputations destroyed over rumors with no truth behind them at all, simply because someone with influence decided it served their purposes to spread them." Edmund reached for her hand, and though she hesitated for a moment, she did not pull away. "I will not let that happen to you," he said, with a quiet, fierce certainty that steadied something trembling inside her chest. "You cannot control what people choose to believe," she said softly. "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but I can control what I choose to do about it, and I promise you, Eleanor, I do not intend to let cruel gossip determine the course of either of our lives." Eleanor wanted, more than anything, to believe him completely, to let his certainty replace her own carefully guarded caution. But even as she allowed herself the comfort of his hand around hers, she could not entirely silence the quiet, persistent fear that someone, somewhere, was working deliberately to ensure his promise would prove impossible to keep. In the weeks that followed the musical evening, Edmund made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than retreating from the growing scrutiny, as caution and years of careful discipline urged him to do, he began appearing with Eleanor more openly than before, escorting her to the theater, walking with her through the busiest promenades of the city at the hours when society was most likely to see them together. It was, he told his aunt, a deliberate strategy, a refusal to let whispered rumors dictate his choices through fear or hiding. "It is either very brave or very foolish," Lady Beatrice observed one afternoon, watching him prepare for an evening at the opera, with more care than she had seen him give his appearance in years. "Perhaps both," he admitted, and his aunt, despite her lingering worries, found she could not entirely disapprove of the change in him. For Eleanor, the growing public nature of their connection brought both comfort and fresh anxiety. Comfort, because Edmund's willingness to be seen with her openly felt like a kind of answer to the rumors that had wounded her so deeply, a public statement that he did not believe the ugly things being whispered about her character. Anxiety, because greater visibility meant greater exposure, and she remained acutely aware that whatever protection Edmund's title offered him, it offered her comparatively little. It was during a quiet evening at Ashford Hall, one of the few occasions Edmund had managed to arrange for them to speak privately, away from the watchful eyes of society, that their conversation turned toward the deeper vulnerabilities each had carefully guarded until then. "Tell me about her," Eleanor said gently, as they sat together near the fire in the smaller receiving room, the one that had mysteriously begun accumulating fresh flowers in recent weeks, the woman who taught you not to trust affection. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and Eleanor wondered if she had overstepped, if the question had reached too deeply into a wound he preferred to keep hidden. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, though carrying an old, familiar weariness. "Her name was Cassandra," he said. "I was younger then, not yet the Duke, still living under my father's shadow, uncertain of my place in the world beyond the eventual weight of a title I did not yet carry. She was kind to me, or seemed to be, and I mistook her kindness for genuine affection. I proposed marriage before I had ever properly courted her, certain of her feelings in a way that now strikes me as almost embarrassingly naive." "What happened?" Eleanor asked softly. "My father discovered, quite by accident, a letter she had written to a friend, describing precisely how she intended to secure the marriage, before any rival could claim my title first, and detailing, in rather uncomfortable specificity, her plans for what she intended to do with my fortune, once the marriage was secured. There was no mention of affection anywhere in the letter, only calculation." Eleanor's chest ached at the quiet pain still evident in his voice, years after the wound had first been inflicted. "I am sorry," she said. "That is a cruel thing to discover about someone you trusted." "It taught me a valuable lesson," he said, though the bitterness in his tone suggested the lesson had cost him more than it had ever taught him. "That affection and calculation often wear identical faces, and a man in my position may never be entirely certain which one he is looking at, until it is too late to matter." "And now," Eleanor asked quietly, "do you still wonder that about me?" Edmund turned to look at her fully, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "No," he said simply. "I did, at first, out of habit more than genuine suspicion. But I have watched you long enough now to know the difference. You have never once asked me for anything, Eleanor. Not my title, not my fortune, not even my time, though I have given it to you freely, and would continue to do so gladly. If anything, you have spent more energy trying to convince me to walk away from you than trying to secure any advantage from my attention." Eleanor felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, and she looked away toward the fire, unwilling to let him see the full extent of what his words had unsettled in her. "My own reasons for caution are simpler than yours," she admitted after a moment. "I have watched my family lose everything once already, through circumstances entirely beyond our control. I learned, perhaps too well, that security cannot be trusted, that comfort can vanish overnight through no fault of one's own. I am not afraid that you will deceive me, Edmund. I am afraid of what happens to people like me when something like this, however genuine, eventually falls apart." Edmund reached for her hand, and this time she did not hesitate before allowing him to take it. "Then let us be afraid together," he said quietly, "rather than letting fear keep us apart entirely." It was, Eleanor thought later, one of the most honest conversations she had ever shared with another person, and it left her feeling both more vulnerable and more certain of her feelings than she had been in weeks. That certainty, however, would soon be tested in ways neither of them anticipated. Whitmore and Gerald, frustrated by the failure of their earlier rumors to separate the couple, had begun planning something far more deliberate, a manufactured scandal, designed not merely to damage Eleanor's reputation through whispers, but to create undeniable public evidence of impropriety that even Edmund's loyalty could not easily overcome. Gerald had learned, through careful and patient inquiry, that Eleanor occasionally visited a small bookshop near the edge of the city on her rare afternoons of freedom, a modest establishment where she could browse novels she could not afford to purchase, indulging in the simple pleasure of reading without the watchful presence of Lady Vane nearby. It was, Gerald realized with quiet satisfaction, precisely the kind of unguarded, unchaperoned moment that could be twisted into something far more damaging than its innocent reality. He shared this information with Whitmore over a private dinner, watching the calculating gleam spread across the other man's face as the shape of their plan began to take form. "If Miss Hartley were to be seen in circumstances that suggested impropriety," Whitmore said slowly, turning his wineglass thoughtfully in his hand, "circumstances that could not easily be explained away, even the Duke's loyalty might not survive the scandal intact. And if it did survive, the damage to her reputation would be severe enough that continuing the connection would become impossible for both their sakes." "You have someone in mind for this task?" Gerald asked. Whitmore smiled, cold and satisfied. "I have several someones in mind," he said. "It is only a matter of arranging the timing correctly." Neither man spoke further of the specifics that evening, but the plan, once set into motion, would prove far more damaging than either Eleanor or Edmund could have anticipated, threatening to undo, in a single evening, everything the fragile trust between them had spent the past 2 months carefully building. In the days that followed their conversation by the fire, Eleanor noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in Edmund's manner toward her. He seemed lighter somehow, as though the act of speaking his old wound aloud had loosened something that had been holding him rigid for years. He began writing to her more frequently, short notes filled with small observations about his day, the particular stubbornness of a new foal born on the estate, a passage from a book he thought she might enjoy, nothing of great consequence, yet each note carried a warmth that Eleanor found herself treasuring more than she wanted to admit. Lady Vane, sensing the depth of what was developing between her companion and the Duke, began treating Eleanor with a newfound, if somewhat transparent, deference, eager to remain in the good graces of a woman who might, however improbably, someday find herself connected to one of the most powerful families in the country. Eleanor found the shift in treatment uncomfortable, rather than flattering, aware that it stemmed entirely from calculation, rather than any genuine change in Lady Vane's regard for her. It was Charlotte's unexpected visit to the city, arranged through funds Eleanor had carefully saved over several months, that brought a welcome respite from the growing tensions surrounding her connection to Edmund. The sisters spent a rare afternoon together, walking through a quieter part of the city, away from the fashionable promenades where Eleanor might be recognized, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in weeks, able to speak freely, without the careful calculation that governed nearly every other conversation in her life. "He sounds like a good man," Charlotte said, once Eleanor had shared, in careful and measured terms, the depth of what had grown between herself and Edmund. "But I worry for you, sister. Good men can still be swept away by circumstances beyond their control, by family pressure and social expectation, however genuine their affections might be in private." "I know," Eleanor admitted. "I think of it every day. But Charlotte, I have not felt this alive in years, not since before Father's business failed and everything became about simply surviving from one month to the next. I do not know if it will last, but I find I am no longer willing to refuse it, simply out of fear that it might not." Charlotte squeezed her hand gently, understanding passing between them without need for further words. "Then I hope, for your sake, that it does last," she said, "and if it does not, you will always have a home with us, whatever happens." The visit ended too quickly, as such visits always did, and Eleanor returned to Lady Vane's townhouse that evening with a renewed sense of courage, resolved to stop guarding her heart so carefully against a happiness that, however uncertain, felt more genuine than anything she had allowed herself to hope for in a very long time. She did not know, as she settled into sleep that night, that Whitmore and Gerald had already set their plan into motion, that a carefully chosen individual had already been instructed on precisely when and how to arrange an encounter designed to look, to any observer who happened to witness it, like undeniable proof of exactly the kind of scheming, calculating character the rumors had already begun to suggest she possessed. The bookshop she visited on her rare afternoons of freedom had already been watched for nearly a week, her habits noted with careful precision, and the trap, though she remained entirely unaware of its existence, had already begun closing quietly around her. Lady Beatrice, meanwhile, found her own resistance continuing to soften with each passing week. She had invited Eleanor to tea, ostensibly to satisfy her own curiosity, though in truth she had wanted the opportunity to judge the young woman's character for herself, away from the distorting influence of gossip and her nephew's obvious affection. What she found surprised her. Eleanor spoke thoughtfully on subjects ranging from literature to estate management, displaying a practical intelligence that Lady Beatrice had rarely encountered among the fashionable young women who typically sought her nephew's attention. More than that, Eleanor asked careful, genuine questions about Edmund's childhood, his relationship with his late father, the responsibilities he carried as Duke, questions that revealed a desire to understand the man, rather than merely enjoy the privileges that came with his position. "You care for him a great deal," Lady Beatrice observed, near the end of their visit, watching Eleanor's expression carefully. "I do," Eleanor admitted, without hesitation, "though I have tried, on more than one occasion, to convince myself that caring for him is not a wise choice, given everything that stands between us." "And has that effort succeeded?" Lady Beatrice asked, with the faintest hint of a knowing smile. Eleanor laughed softly, shaking her head. Not even slightly, she admitted. Lady Beatrice studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though some final judgment had been reached and settled in Eleanor's favor. Good, she said simply. He has spent far too many years guarding himself against exactly this kind of feeling. I confess I had my doubts when the gossip first began, but I find I no longer share them, whatever obstacles society might still place before you both. The words settled warmly in Eleanor's chest, a small but meaningful victory in the midst of so much uncertainty, and she left Lady Beatrice's home that afternoon with a lightness she had not felt in weeks, entirely unaware of how quickly that lightness was about to be tested. The bookshop was quiet that afternoon, the way it always was during the early hours before the fashionable crowds emerged for their evening engagements, and Eleanor moved through the familiar rows of shelves with the particular contentment of someone briefly free from the watchful eyes that governed so much of her daily life. She had nearly 2 hours before she needed to return to Lady Vane's townhouse, and she intended to spend every minute of it lost in the quiet pleasure of books she could not afford but loved regardless. She did not notice the man who entered shortly after her, well-dressed and unfamiliar, who seemed to browse the shelves with far less interest in the books themselves than in Eleanor's location within the shop. She did not notice him drawing closer as she became absorbed in a volume of poetry, nor did she notice the careful, deliberate way he positioned himself beside her, close enough that anyone glancing through the shop's front window might mistake the proximity for familiarity. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to be heard beyond the two of them, though Eleanor did not immediately recognize the false warmth in his tone as anything other than an unfamiliar acquaintance being politely friendly. "What a pleasant surprise to find you here." Eleanor turned, startled, uncertain how the stranger knew her name. "I am sorry," she said carefully. "I do not believe we have been introduced." The man smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes, and reached toward her, as though to take her hand in greeting, a gesture Eleanor instinctively pulled back from, though not quickly enough to avoid the brief contact that would later be described, by witnesses conveniently positioned outside the shop's window, as considerably more intimate than it had actually been. It was at that precise moment, through some cruel coincidence that Eleanor would later realize had been no coincidence at all, that Lady Winslow and 2 of her closest friends happened to pass by the shop window, pausing at the sight of Eleanor within, apparently engaged in warm, private conversation with an unfamiliar gentleman, in a location entirely removed from the chaperoned propriety expected of any respectable young woman. By the following morning, the story had already begun spreading through the city, with the particular speed reserved for scandals involving people of interest. Eleanor Hartley, it was whispered, had been discovered in a private, unchaperoned meeting with a mysterious gentleman, her hand held affectionately in his, in a secluded bookshop far from the fashionable parts of the city, a meeting that could only suggest either a secret arrangement, or worse still, an attempt to secure a second suitor, while simultaneously pursuing the Duke of Ashford's affections. Lady Vane heard the rumor before Eleanor had even returned from her afternoon errands, and her earlier deference evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating fury at the thought of her own reputation being tarnished by association with a companion now suspected of such scandalous behavior. "Explain yourself," Lady Vane demanded the moment Eleanor stepped through the door, her expression thunderous. "I have heard the most alarming account of your afternoon, Eleanor, and I expect a full explanation immediately." Eleanor, bewildered, recounted the encounter exactly as it had happened, an unfamiliar man approaching her in a bookshop, a brief and entirely unwanted attempt at greeting that she had pulled away from immediately. But even as she spoke, she could see in Lady Vane's face that the explanation was not being believed, that the version of events already circulating through the city held far more weight than the truth spoken quietly in a private drawing room. "I cannot afford to have my household associated with this kind of scandal," Lady Vane said, her voice cold with the particular cruelty of someone protecting her own interests above all else. "I am afraid I must let you go, Eleanor, effective immediately." The words landed like a physical blow. Eleanor had known, in some distant corner of her mind, that her position was always precarious, that Lady Vane's goodwill had never been entirely reliable, but to hear it stated so plainly, so quickly, in the wake of an incident she had not caused and could not have prevented, left her feeling as though the ground beneath her had simply vanished. "Where am I meant to go?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely steady. "That is no longer my concern," Lady Vane said, already turning away, her mind evidently occupied with the more pressing matter of salvaging her own reputation from the taint of scandal. Eleanor spent that night in a small inn on the edge of the city, having gathered what few possessions she could carry, her mind spinning through the wreckage of a situation she still did not fully understand. She had written to Edmund immediately, a brief note explaining what had happened, though she had no way of knowing whether the rumors had already reached him first, twisted and distorted beyond any resemblance to the truth. They had. By the time Edmund received her letter, he had already heard 3 separate accounts of the incident from 3 separate sources, each version more damning than the last, and though his instinct was to trust Eleanor completely, the sheer volume and consistency of the rumors left even his steady certainty briefly, painfully shaken. He arrived at Lady Vane's townhouse, only to learn Eleanor had already been dismissed, and had left without any clear indication of her destination, and the panic that seized him in that moment surprised him with its intensity, a fear far sharper than anything he had felt in years. He found her, eventually, through the careful and quiet inquiries of his most trusted servant, at the small inn where she had taken a modest room, and when he arrived, he found her sitting alone by a narrow window, her composure clearly maintained through considerable effort. "Eleanor," he said, and she turned, her expression a careful, guarded neutrality that told him immediately how deeply she had already begun preparing herself for his rejection. "You should not have come," she said quietly. "It will only make the scandal worse." "I do not care about the scandal," he said. "I care about you, and about understanding exactly what happened." She told him everything, the stranger's unexpected approach, the brief and unwanted contact, Lady Winslow's convenient appearance at precisely the wrong moment, and as she spoke, Edmund felt a cold, furious clarity settle over him, a certainty that what had happened had been no accident at all. "This was arranged," he said, once she had finished. "Someone orchestrated this deliberately, to damage you and separate us." "I do not know who would do such a thing," Eleanor said, though even as she spoke, doubt was already beginning to creep into her voice, weariness replacing the fight that had carried her through the worst of the previous day. Edmund, however, was already turning the pieces over in his mind, recalling his cousin's suspiciously convenient visits, Whitmore's cold warning in the gardens weeks earlier, the particular timing of a scandal that served both men's interests so precisely. "I believe I do," he said grimly. But even as certainty settled over him regarding who bore responsibility, Eleanor's resolve had already begun to harden in an entirely different direction, one Edmund had not anticipated, and would find far more difficult to overcome than any external scandal. "I cannot keep doing this," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes fixed on the narrow window rather than on him. "I have lost my position, Edmund. I have no protection, no fortune, nothing standing between myself and complete ruin except your affection, which, however genuine, cannot shield me from every scheme designed to separate us. I am not strong enough to survive another scandal like this one, and I fear, given everything that has already happened, there will be another, and another after that, for as long as men like whoever orchestrated this believe they can profit from our separation." Edmund reached for her hand, but for the first time since they had begun this fragile, uncertain courtship, she pulled away. "I think," she said, her voice breaking slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed, "that it would be best if we did not see each other again. Not because I do not care for you, Edmund. I care for you more than I have ever cared for anyone, but because caring for you is no longer safe for either of us, and I am not willing to watch you sacrifice everything you have built, your family's standing, your own peace, simply to protect a companion society has already decided to condemn." Edmund stood frozen for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him with a force that felt almost physical. He had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of vulnerability, this exact risk of loving someone only to lose them, and now, faced with the very outcome he had spent so long guarding against, he found himself entirely unprepared for how much it hurt. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "please do not do this." "I am sorry," she whispered, tears finally slipping free despite her efforts to hold them back. "I am so sorry, Edmund. But I have to protect what little I have left, and right now, That means protecting myself from a heartbreak I am not certain I could survive twice. He left the inn that evening with no resolution, no promise, only the hollow, aching certainty that he had finally found the one thing he wanted more than anything else in his life, only to watch it slip away through circumstances neither of them had created, but both of them would have to find a way to overcome, if there was any hope of a future together at all. In the days that followed, Edmund threw himself into uncovering the truth behind the scandal, with a single-minded determination that startled even Lady Beatrice, who had rarely seen her nephew pursue anything with such open, unguarded intensity. He questioned his own household staff, his tenants, anyone who might have observed unusual activity in the days leading up to the incident at the bookshop, and slowly, carefully, the pieces began falling into place. A stable boy in Whitmore's employ, bribed with a sum far beyond what his loyalty could withstand, eventually confirmed what Edmund had already suspected. A gentleman had been paid, quite handsomely, to approach a young woman in a bookshop at a specific hour, to engage her in conversation, and to ensure the encounter was witnessed by individuals known for their fondness of gossip. The stable boy could not say who had ultimately ordered the arrangement, only that instructions and payment had passed through Whitmore's household before reaching the man who had carried it out. Armed with this information, though it remained frustratingly circumstantial, Edmund confronted Whitmore directly, arriving unannounced at his townhouse, with a coldness in his manner that left no doubt about the seriousness of his purpose. "I know what you did," Edmund said, without preamble, the moment Whitmore received him in his study. Whitmore's composure flickered only briefly, before settling back into practiced indifference. "I have no notion what you mean, Your Grace," he said smoothly. "I am hardly responsible for the unfortunate behavior of a woman who cannot seem to conduct herself with appropriate discretion." "You arranged for a man to approach her," Edmund said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You ensured witnesses would be present to twist an innocent encounter into something scandalous. I have a witness who can confirm payment traced through your household." Whitmore's expression hardened, the mask of polite indifference finally slipping to reveal something colder and more calculating beneath. "Even if such an arrangement existed," he said, his voice carrying a quiet threat, "I would remind you, Your Grace, that accusations without solid proof tend to damage the accuser as much as the accused, particularly when the accuser is already the subject of considerable gossip regarding his own judgment where a certain companion is concerned. Perhaps it would be wiser for everyone involved if this matter simply faded quietly away." Edmund left the townhouse with fury simmering beneath his controlled exterior, aware that Whitmore was correct in one respect. Proving the scheme conclusively enough to salvage Eleanor's reputation through legal or social means would prove nearly impossible, not without risking further damage to her already fragile standing. But he had learned enough to understand the shape of what he was fighting against, and more importantly, he had learned enough to recognize that half measures and quiet investigations would never be sufficient to undo the damage that had already been done. If Eleanor's reputation was to be restored, if their future together was to survive the calculated cruelty of men like Whitmore and his own cousin Gerald, it would require something far more decisive than careful inquiries conducted behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Eleanor had taken refuge with a distant cousin on the edge of the city, a quiet, elderly woman who asked no questions and offered what small comfort she could, though Eleanor found herself unable to fully accept even that modest kindness, weighed down as she was by grief and the persistent, exhausting fear of what her future now held. She had written to Charlotte, explaining everything, and her sister's reply had arrived within days, full of concern and an open invitation to return home immediately, whatever the cost. Eleanor considered it seriously, packing her few remaining possessions more than once, only to find herself hesitating each time, unable to fully release the fragile hope that somehow, despite everything, the situation might yet be salvaged. She told herself this hesitation was foolish, that she had already made her choice at the inn, that continuing to hope for a resolution that seemed increasingly impossible would only prolong her own suffering. And yet, each evening, she found herself thinking of Edmund's steady presence, his quiet certainty, the particular warmth of conversations shared by the fire at Ashford Hall, and she could not entirely convince herself that walking away had been the right choice, however necessary it had seemed in the raw, frightened aftermath of losing everything at once. It was nearly 2 weeks after their painful parting at the inn that Eleanor received an unexpected visitor, not Edmund himself, but Lady Beatrice, arriving unannounced with an expression of fierce, determined purpose that Eleanor had not seen from her before. "I have come to tell you that you are a fool," Lady Beatrice said, without any preamble at all, settling herself into the small sitting room's only comfortable chair, as though she owned it. Eleanor blinked, too startled by the blunt greeting to formulate an immediate response. "My nephew has spent the past 2 weeks like a ghost, haunting his own house," Lady Beatrice continued. "He does not eat properly. He barely sleeps. He has uncovered enough evidence to know precisely who orchestrated the scandal that separated you, and rather than using that knowledge to salvage his own reputation by distancing himself from the entire unfortunate affair, he has spent every waking hour trying to determine how he might instead salvage yours. And you, meanwhile, sit here hiding from the very thing you claim to want most, because you have convinced yourself that loving him is too dangerous a risk to take." "It is dangerous," Eleanor said quietly. "You saw what happened. What they are capable of doing to protect their own interests." "I did see," Lady Beatrice agreed. "And I will tell you honestly, my dear, that the world we live in is often cruel to women who dare to want more than what they have been given. But I have also seen, in 2 weeks, exactly what kind of man my nephew becomes when he finally allows himself to want something enough to fight for it. I do not think, whatever caution tells you, that you will find many men willing to fight so thoroughly for anything in their lives, let alone for you." Eleanor felt the careful walls she had built over the past 2 weeks beginning to tremble, threatening to give way entirely beneath the weight of Lady Beatrice's blunt, unwavering honesty. "What would you have me do?" she asked quietly. Lady Beatrice's expression softened, just slightly. "I would have you trust him," she said, "and more than that, I would have you trust yourself enough to fight for what you want, rather than surrendering it simply because fighting feels dangerous. You are not without allies, Eleanor, whatever this past fortnight may have convinced you. There are more of us willing to stand beside you than you currently believe." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment after Lady Beatrice departed, turning the words over carefully, feeling something long buried beginning, cautiously, to stir back to life within her chest. She thought of Edmund's steady hands, his quiet certainty by the fire, the particular way he had looked at her from across a crowded ballroom on the very first night they had met, as though she were the only person in the room worth truly seeing. Perhaps, she thought, walking away had never truly been the answer. Perhaps the only way forward was not retreat, but the very thing she had spent her entire life avoiding out of necessity, a willingness to risk everything for the chance at something worth having. Lady Winslow's annual autumn ball had, for years, been considered the final grand event of the season, the gathering where every important match of the year was either confirmed or quietly abandoned. And this year, it seemed, would prove no exception to that tradition, though not in any way its hostess could have anticipated when she first sent out her invitations. Edmund arrived with a purpose that set him apart from every other guest moving through the crowded ballroom, his expression carrying none of the guarded caution he had worn at every gathering for years. He had spent the past week quietly gathering every piece of evidence his investigation had uncovered, and more importantly, he had spent the past week deciding, with a clarity that felt like relief after years of careful restraint, exactly what he intended to do with that evidence. Eleanor arrived later, escorted by Lady Beatrice herself, a decision that had already sent a ripple of surprised whispers through the assembled crowd, before either woman had even removed their wraps. Eleanor had debated for days whether she possessed the courage to face society again after the humiliation of the scandal. But Lady Beatrice's fierce insistence, combined with her own quiet resolve to stop hiding from a life she genuinely wanted, had finally carried her through the ballroom's tall doors. The whispers began almost immediately, curious and speculative, though Eleanor found, to her own surprise, that she could bear them now with a steadiness that had eluded her in the raw aftermath of the scandal. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled to a distant cousin's quiet sitting room. She had come tonight with purpose, and whatever happened, she intended to face it standing rather than hiding. Edmund saw her the moment she entered, and for the first time since the night of the garden party, he did not hesitate at all. He crossed the ballroom directly toward her, ignoring the dozens of curious eyes following his every step, ignoring the young women who had once hoped to catch his attention and now watched with open astonishment as he moved past them entirely. "Eleanor," he said, stopping before her, his voice carrying clearly enough that several nearby guests turned to listen. "Your Grace," she said carefully, aware of the audience gathering around them. "I owe you an apology," he said, and something in his tone, open and unguarded in a way she had rarely heard him speak in public, made the surrounding whispers fall briefly silent. "I allowed you to walk away 2 weeks ago because I believed, in that moment, that respecting your wishes meant giving you the space you asked for. But I have come to understand that what you truly needed was not space, but certainty, proof that I was willing to fight for you, as openly and completely as you deserved, from the very beginning." "Edmund," she began softly, uncertain where this public declaration was heading, but he continued before she could finish. "I know who orchestrated the scandal that separated us," he said, raising his voice now, deliberately, so that it carried across the increasingly quiet ballroom. "Lord Callum Whitmore paid a man to approach Miss Hartley in a bookshop and arranged for witnesses to be present, specifically to twist an innocent encounter into scandal, with the assistance of my own cousin, Gerald Ashford, whose interest in preserving his position in my family's inheritance made him more than willing to see any woman I cared for driven away through whatever means necessary." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd, heads turning toward where Whitmore stood near the refreshment table, his face draining of color, as every eye in the ballroom shifted toward him. "This is outrageous," Whitmore said, his composure cracking under the sudden weight of public scrutiny. "Baseless accusations, made without any proof whatsoever." "I have a signed statement from the man you paid to approach her," Edmund said, calm and unshaken, "and a witness who can confirm the payment traced directly through your household. I did not come here tonight to destroy you publicly, Whitmore, though you certainly deserve it. I came here to make certain that everyone in this room understands, beyond any doubt, that Miss Eleanor Hartley did nothing wrong. She was the target of a deliberate scheme, orchestrated by men too small, and too fearful of losing their own advantages, to accept that a duke might actually choose to love someone, for reasons that had nothing to do with fortune or title." The ballroom had fallen almost entirely silent now, every guest present, straining to hear every word of a scene none of them would soon forget. Whitmore, recognizing the impossibility of salvaging his position under such public scrutiny, made a hasty, humiliated retreat toward the door, Gerald following soon after, his earlier easy charm entirely abandoned in the face of Edmund's unwavering certainty. Edmund turned back to Eleanor then, and though the entire ballroom remained watching, his attention narrowed entirely onto her, as though they were the only two people present. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I have loved you since a night many weeks ago, when you looked at me across this very ballroom and saw nothing but a man mildly amused by his own party's absurdity, rather than a title worth pursuing. I do not care what society whispers about the difference in our stations. I do not care what obstacles my family or the wider world might place before us. I have spent 7 years protecting myself from exactly this kind of vulnerability, and I find, having finally allowed myself to feel it fully, that I would rather risk everything for the chance of a life with you than spend 1 more year safely, comfortably alone." Eleanor felt tears gathering, unable and unwilling to hold them back any longer. The weight of 2 weeks of careful, protective distance finally crumbling entirely beneath the honest, public certainty of his words. "I was so afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly, though she did not look away from him. "Afraid of losing everything I had left. Afraid of loving someone so completely, only to watch it be taken away, through no fault of my own. But I have spent these past 2 weeks discovering that walking away from you did not actually protect me from anything at all. It only guaranteed the very unhappiness I was trying so desperately to avoid." "Then let us stop being afraid together," Edmund said, echoing the words he had spoken to her weeks earlier, and this time, Eleanor did not hesitate before closing the distance between them entirely. The ballroom erupted into a mixture of gasps and murmurs as Edmund took her hand before the entire assembled company, and Lady Beatrice, watching from a few steps away, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, the culmination of weeks spent quietly hoping for exactly this outcome. In the carriage on the way to Lady Winslow's ball, Eleanor had sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching the city pass by through the window, rehearsing every possible outcome the evening might bring. She had imagined cold stares, cruel whispers, perhaps even outright refusal at the door, since her name had become so thoroughly entangled with scandal in recent weeks. What she had not imagined, not truly, was the particular terror of hope, the fragile possibility that something good might still come from an evening she had nearly refused to attend at all. Lady Beatrice, seated across from her, had reached over at one point and taken her hand firmly. "Whatever happens tonight," she had said, "you will walk through those doors, with your head held high, because you have done nothing to be ashamed of. Let them stare. Let them whisper. It has never once stopped anything worth having." Eleanor had held on to those words as the carriage arrived, as she climbed the wide stone steps toward the brightly lit entrance, as she handed her wrap to a footman whose expression gave nothing away, and as she stepped, finally, into a ballroom filled with exactly the kind of curious, judging eyes she had spent 2 weeks trying to avoid entirely. It had taken every ounce of courage she possessed not to turn immediately and flee back into the safety of the carriage, but she had thought, in that moment, of Edmund's steady certainty, of Lady Beatrice's fierce insistence that she was not without allies, and she had forced herself to remain standing, chin lifted, refusing to give the assembled crowd the satisfaction of watching her retreat. When Edmund had crossed the room toward her, ignoring every other guest present exactly as he had done that very first night many weeks earlier, Eleanor had felt something shift inside her chest, a fragile hope she had spent 2 weeks trying desperately to extinguish, blooming back to life despite every careful effort to protect herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. The scene that followed, his public confrontation of Whitmore, his open declaration before the entire assembled company, had unfolded with a speed that left Eleanor feeling almost breathless, as though she were watching events happen to someone else entirely, until his hand closed around hers, and the reality of it settled fully into her chest. In the days immediately following the ball, the story of what had happened spread through the city with the same speed the original scandal had once traveled, though this time, the narrative favored Eleanor entirely. Whitmore's public humiliation and hasty departure from society circles became, itself, a topic of considerable gossip, and more than one former critic of Eleanor's character found themselves quietly reconsidering their earlier judgments in light of such clear and public evidence of the scheme against her. Lady Vane, upon hearing of the dramatic reversal, made a rather transparent attempt to reconcile with her former companion, sending a carefully worded letter suggesting that perhaps their earlier parting had been hasty, and that Eleanor would always be welcome to return, should circumstances require it. Eleanor read the letter once, with a small, humorless smile, and set it aside without responding, feeling no particular need to maintain a connection that had proven, in her moment of greatest need, entirely without loyalty. Edmund, for his part, spent the weeks following the ball formally introducing Eleanor to the wider circle of his family's oldest and most respected connections, determined that whatever remained of society's doubt would be met not with hiding, but with open, confident presentation of the woman he intended to marry. It was not always comfortable. There remained older relations who received Eleanor with visible reluctance, elderly aunts and distant cousins who muttered about declining standards and unsuitable matches, within earshot clearly meant to be heard. But Edmund met each instance of coldness with the same steady, unwavering support he had shown from the very beginning, and slowly, gradually, even the most reluctant relations began to soften in the face of his obvious, unshakable devotion. Society did not abandon its habit of gossip entirely, and there remained those who continued to whisper about the impropriety of a duke marrying so far beneath his station, regardless of the public exposure of Whitmore's scheme. But Edmund faced each whisper with the same steady certainty he had shown that night in Lady Winslow's ballroom. And slowly, gradually, the wider society that had once doubted Eleanor's character began, if not entirely embracing her, at least accepting the inevitability of a match that clearly would not be undone by mere disapproval. Gerald, stripped of his cousin's goodwill and much of his standing within polite society, following the public revelation of his role in the scheme, retreated to a quiet, considerably reduced existence in the countryside, his earlier ambitions toward inheritance permanently and thoroughly extinguished. Whitmore fared little better, his reputation among his own circle irreparably damaged by the scandal of his exposure, though he remained, to the end, unrepentant about the cruelty he had orchestrated in pursuit of his own advantage. Eleanor's sister Charlotte attended the wedding the following spring, held not in the grand cathedral favored by most society weddings, but in the smaller, quieter chapel near Ashford Hall, at Eleanor's own request, surrounded by the handful of people who had stood by her through the difficult months of scandal and uncertainty. Lady Beatrice, seated in the front pew with an expression of unmistakable pride, later confessed to more than one guest that she had never seen her nephew look quite so thoroughly, unguardedly happy in all the years she had known him. Edmund often thought, in the years that followed, of that first night at his own ball, of 100 women who had approached him, hoping to win his favor through careful performance and practiced charm, and of the one woman who had wanted nothing from him at all, who had simply stood at the edge of a crowded room, watching clumsy dancers with quiet amusement, entirely unaware that her indifference would prove more compelling than every calculated pursuit that came before it. He had spent years believing that love, when it came wrapped in genuine affection rather than calculation, was a risk too dangerous to accept. Eleanor had taught him, slowly and patiently, that the greater danger lay not in loving someone fully, but in refusing to, out of fear of what might be lost. It was a lesson, he often told her in the quiet years of their marriage that followed, worth every ounce of risk it had ultimately required, and one he never once regretted learning, however painful the path toward it had proven to be. A full year passed before Eleanor felt entirely settled into her new life as Duchess of Ashford, a title that still, on occasion, caught her by surprise when servants used it to address her, or when she caught sight of her own reflection, dressed in gowns far finer than anything she had once believed she would ever own. The early months of marriage brought their own quiet adjustments, learning the full weight of responsibilities that came with managing so vast an estate, growing accustomed to a household staff who had, at first, watched her with the same cautious uncertainty society had once shown, before gradually coming to respect the genuine care she brought to every decision affecting their welfare. She had insisted, early in their marriage, on visiting the Tennant families personally, something Edmund's own mother had rarely done, and the Tennants, unaccustomed to such direct attention from the family occupying the great house, had responded with a warmth that surprised even Eleanor herself. She remembered too well what it felt like to depend on the goodwill of others for her survival, and she was determined that no family under Ashford's protection would ever feel as invisible as she once had, standing at the edges of gatherings she did not truly belong to. Charlotte visited often in that first year, bringing with her news of their mother's improving health, made possible in no small part by the financial security Eleanor's marriage had brought to the entire family. Where once Eleanor had sent modest wages home each month, carefully rationed from her limited earnings as a companion, she now had the means to ensure her mother wanted for nothing, a change so profound that Eleanor sometimes found herself overwhelmed by simple gratitude in quiet, unguarded moments. Lady Beatrice remained a constant presence in their lives, her early skepticism long since transformed into genuine affection, and she took considerable pride in reminding anyone who would listen that she had recognized Eleanor's true character long before the wider society had come around to the same conclusion. She became, in time, something close to the mother Eleanor had lost touch with during the difficult years following her father's ruin, offering guidance not out of obligation, but out of a warmth that had grown steadily since that first difficult tea when she had come, uninvited, to judge Eleanor's character for herself. Gerald's fate, in the years that followed his public disgrace, remained a quiet cautionary tale, whispered occasionally among those who remembered the scandal. Stripped of his standing, and much of the family's goodwill, he retreated entirely from London society, his once easy charm curdled by years of resentment he had brought upon himself. Edmund, despite everything, occasionally sent modest support to ensure his cousin did not fall into genuine hardship, a decision Eleanor questioned only once, gently, before understanding that Edmund's capacity for forgiveness, however hard-won, was simply part of the same steady character that had first drawn her to him. Whitmore fared considerably worse. His reputation, thoroughly and publicly destroyed by the revelation of his scheme, followed him for years afterward, a permanent stain that no amount of wealth or connection could fully erase. He eventually withdrew from London entirely, settling on a distant estate where his bitterness, by all accounts, only deepened with each passing season, a fate Eleanor found she could not bring herself to feel any particular sympathy for, given the suffering he had so deliberately caused. It was in the spring of their second year together that Eleanor discovered she was carrying their first child, News that brought Edmund a joy so profound and unguarded that even Lady Beatrice, who had witnessed the full transformation of her once solitary nephew, found herself moved to tears at the sight of it. Edmund, who had spent so many years believing himself incapable of the kind of open, vulnerable happiness other men seemed to find so easily, discovered in the months that followed a depth of contentment he had never allowed himself to imagine possible. Their daughter was born on a cold morning in late winter, and Edmund held her for the first time, with the same careful, reverent attention he had once reserved only for the weight of his family's legacy, a legacy that now felt, to him, considerably lighter and more joyful than it ever had before Eleanor entered his life. They named her Margaret, after Eleanor's mother, a small gesture that meant more to Eleanor than any grand estate or title ever could. In the years that followed, Eleanor often found herself thinking back to that first night at Edmund's ball, to the version of herself who had stood at the edge of a crowded room, watching clumsy dancers with quiet amusement, entirely unaware that her life was about to change so completely. She had approached that evening with no particular expectation beyond the simple duty of accompanying Lady Vane, and she marveled, even years later, at how differently her life had unfolded from anything she could have predicted standing there with her glass of lemonade, watching a duke she assumed she would never speak to beyond the barest formalities. Edmund, for his part, often told the story of that first night to their children, as they grew older, embellishing certain details with each retelling, though the core of it remained unchanged. He would describe, with obvious delight, the particular shock of encountering a woman who looked at him and saw nothing worth pursuing, and the slow, unexpected way that indifference had unraveled years of carefully constructed distance he had built around his own heart. I had convinced myself that love and calculation always wore the same face, he told his eldest daughter once, years later, when she came to him anxious about a young man who had begun courting her with considerably more enthusiasm than sincerity. Your mother taught me that genuine affection rarely announces itself so loudly. Often it simply stands quietly at the edge of the room, entirely unconcerned with whether you notice it at all, and that, I have come to believe, is precisely how you know it is real. Eleanor, listening from the doorway, smiled at the familiar story, though it never failed to move her, even after so many years, to hear the man who had once been described by all of society as the Duke, who rejected 100 women, speak with such open, unguarded tenderness about the one woman who had never once tried to win him. Their marriage was not without its ordinary difficulties, the small disagreements and adjustments that came with any genuine partnership, the occasional worry over estate matters or the health of their growing children, the ordinary friction of two strong-willed people learning to build a life together. But beneath every disagreement remained a foundation neither of them ever seriously doubted again, forged in the fire of scandal and public confrontation, tested by forces determined to tear them apart, and proven, in the end, considerably stronger than anything society's cruelty could hope to break. Ashford Hall, once a place of quiet, guarded solitude, became known throughout the county for its warmth, its open hospitality, and the particular joy of its mistress, who never forgot what it felt like to stand at the edges of gatherings she did not belong to, and who made certain, for the rest of her life, that no one within her reach would ever have to feel that particular loneliness for very long. And Edmund, who had once believed himself destined to spend his life guarding against exactly the kind of vulnerability that love required, found instead that the greatest fortune of his entire life had not been his title, nor his vast estate, nor the wealth he had spent so many years protecting from those who sought to claim it, through calculation and deceit. His greatest fortune had been a woman in a pale green gown, standing quietly at the edge of a crowded ballroom, who had looked at him and seen, for the very first time in his adult life, simply a man worth knowing, rather than a prize worth winning. It was, he often reflected in the quiet, contented years that followed, worth every risk it had taken to finally cross that room,